Welcome to this introduction video on how REDCap can be used in data management planning. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how REDCap complements data management planning, or DMPs. By the end of this video, you should have an understanding of data management planning and its importance, understand the data lifecycle, and understand which data lifecycle steps are supported by REDCap. Before we discuss how REDCap can support data management planning, let's briefly review what is meant by data management planning. Note that here we are focusing on the research context, although a similar idea exists in the community context, for example, called data governance planning. Although the two are similar, the details could be different. A data management plan, or DMP, is a document that captures how you will collect your data and what you will do with your data during and after a study or project. A DMP includes the type of data, the collection methods, data organization, and long and short-term storage plans, as well as compliance with ethics and any other regulations. There are several reasons for why you need a data management plan. First of all, a DMP supports data collection and management planning. This saves time and prevents frustration in the long run by having everything planned out ahead of time. It also acts as a guide during the project, documents and tracks important considerations like ethics, regulations, and things like that. And finally, some funding agencies require DMPs, either as part of the proposal process or as a condition of the funding. Going into detail on how to make a DMP or what to include in a DMP is beyond the scope of this video. However, for more information, you can access the DMP Assistant, the link is provided here, or contact Athabasca University's Research Data Management Librarian. A core aspect of the data management plan is accommodating or planning for the data lifecycle. The data lifecycle includes 7 steps: planning, creating and collecting, processing, analyzing, disseminating, preserving, and reusing. REDCap is useful for several of these steps, particularly planning, creating and collecting, processing, preserving, and reusing phases of the data lifecycle. And we'll go over how REDCap can support each of these steps. First, REDCap can support the planning portion of the data lifecycle and DMPs. Planning the overall study design, surveys or measures used, or how data collection is going to be achieved, for example, either directly into REDCap via public survey link or using a device in a research or clinical setting, all of that needs to be established before starting in REDCap. However, REDCap can also be used to capture that planning or decision-making. As the study is designed and measures are added, REDCap automatically creates and updates code books and data dictionaries that are useful for that document and planning. At the planning stage, it's important to realize that REDCap is not a long-term data repository, so longer-term data storage needs to be part of that planning. And REDCap is not a document repository, so it's not a place to store, for example, the DMP documents or validation studies for your measure, so that also needs to be planned for elsewhere. Ethics review and approval is a major part of the planning portion of the data lifecycle and creating the DMP. You need a plan to get funding and to apply for ethics approval, and the outcomes of the proposal and ethics review will affect your DMP. If you have any questions about ethics and how that could affect your DMP or your REDCap project, contact the Athabasca University Research Ethics Officer. REDCap can support ethical considerations in a number of ways. First, REDCap can be used to protect confidential or identified information. When creating your questions or forms, you can indicate which variables contain sensitive or identified information, and this indication will affect who can view that data and how or if it can be downloaded. To learn more about how to do this, see our other videos on creating questions in REDCap. You can also give REDCap users or teammates different access rights or privileges. This determines who can view data, who can access or download the data, who can enter or change data, whether you can see data across sites or only specific to your data collection site, and so on. To learn more about how to do this, see our other videos on data access and download. Note, however, that you can only control access to surveys or forms. You can't control access based on specific items. So, for example, items that have identifiable information. So if you want to restrict access to identifying data in REDCap to specific team members, you should consider putting all identifying variables into their own form or survey. And that way you can restrict who can view or access that form specifically. Again, factors around identifying information need to be considered in the planning stage and while the REDCap tool is being designed. REDCap can also generate documents that support an ethics application. So for example, through data dictionaries and codebooks that capture the exact measures that will be used. You can access your data dictionary or codebook under Project Home and Design on the left-hand navigation pane. When you click on Dictionary, you're taken to the Data Dictionary page. You can download the current data dictionary by clicking on Download the current data dictionary and saving it as an Excel file. You can access the codebook by either clicking on Codebook in the left navigation panel or by clicking on the Codebook tab. You can download your codebook by clicking Print Page and then saving it as a PDF file. REDCap can also support ethics requirements through consent form creation. There's no special module in REDCap for creating consent forms. They're just created using the same survey and measure features as any other form or measure in REDCap. But the design and logic in the consent form needs to be well thought out and planned in advance in order to make sure that consent is indicated as appropriate for your study design and that participants who do not consent don't go on to access questions or participate further. It's possible to design a consent form in REDCap that will accommodate a variety of research designs, including face-to-face or on-site recruiting and consent, forwarding consent forms by email before additional data collection is scheduled, or public-facing survey links where all data is collected independent of the researcher. But some planning and testing is required to make sure that your consent form works as needed for your specific project. This is an example of a consent form created in REDCap using the same question and survey tools as presented in previous videos. The bulk of the consent form information is captured in a descriptive text field or variable. This is a field that displays information but doesn't capture any information. And you can also use the rich text editor option to format the text with bold or underline, centering, and so on. You can also just copy and paste text from your consent form into this field, but make sure to double check the formatting. There are two options for obtaining consent that are shown here. Both are shown for illustrative purposes only, and typically only one approach would be used for your study. And these are not the only ways to capture consent. The approach that works best for you will depend on your research design and research question. The first approach to indicating consent captures the participant's name and their signature, and both of these are identifying information and need to be marked as such in REDCap. The consent form explains what that signature means with respect to consent and participation. And the signature can be directly drawn into REDCap using a touchscreen, which is the example here, but there's also an option for creating a field or variable in REDCap that would allow a signature or a printed, signed, and scanned consent form to be uploaded directly into REDCap. Note that here all three variable names, first name, last name, and signature, are coded to require a response from the participant. This means that a participant needs to clearly indicate that they consent to participate in the study by providing responses to all three variables in order to move on to the next survey or measure. A second approach captures consent by asking the participant to indicate understanding and consent by clicking yes. The same approach is used in that the participant is told what clicking yes signifies with respect to consent and participation. And this approach is useful for public surveys or anonymous contacts where the researcher doesn't want to or can't collect participant names. Note that the coding is similar to the signature example. The participant has to provide a response in order to move on to the next survey or measure. Also note that there is stop coding in place here, which means that if a participant indicates that they don't consent by clicking no, then this will trigger the end of the survey. So they won't be moved on to the following questions or surveys. There are also other consents that need to be incorporated into the consent form, and if they're missing, they will likely be flagged by the Ethics Review Committee unless explicitly covered. These are consents around permission to be contacted for future studies, for data repository upload, and future uses of the data that's being collected. In the example here, the options are explained to the participant, and they indicate their choice by clicking yes or no. Note that these are coded to still be required responses, but there's no stop logic. And that's because participants can still participate in the study even if they don't want to be contacted or to have their data uploaded or shared in any way. Again, the language will vary depending on your specific study. So for example, if you don't ever intend to share the data, then you can just say the data will never be shared in the consent form and no additional permissions are needed from the participant. Once the consent form is completed, you can use the survey features to determine or program what will happen next. And use of survey features was covered in an earlier video. For example, you could set it up so that the next survey or measure automatically appears once the consent is completed. You could also set it up so the consent form just ends and you're notified by email to follow up with that participant. Or you could set it up so that nothing happens and either the interviewer or the REDCap app user has to manually save and then open the next survey or measure. It all depends on your survey design. Within the data lifecycle, REDCap's most obvious use is for data creation and collection. How that data creation and collection will be done is determined in the planning phase, where the REDCap design and measures are created. Most of the previous instructional videos focus on REDCap's use for this purpose. Again, REDCap can accommodate a wide variety of research designs and data, and if you have any questions about how your study maps onto REDCap, you can contact the Athabasca University REDCap administrator. REDCap can also accommodate a wide variety of data capture approaches, including direct data entry by a participant or a research assistant, data collection on study devices using the REDCap app, creating personalized surveys for specific participants, creating a general or public survey link, and sending text messages or mobile reminders. Again, if you have any questions about how REDCap can map onto your specific data collection, contact the REDCap administrator. REDCap can also play a role in the processing phase of the data lifecycle, although the ability to process or analyze data in REDCap is fairly minimal. One way that REDCap can support this is through creation of fields or variables that calculate values from data that's already entered into REDCap. So for example, REDCap can be used to calculate current age based on birth dates and that date, the current date. And this feature can be handy because you're calculating age as you go, and it allows you not to have to download birth date data, which is an identifier variable. REDCap also has some basic analyzing capabilities, mostly limited to descriptive statistics. And these can be accessed through the data exports, reports, and stats application and are described in a previous video on accessing and downloading the data. And REDCap also has some ability to clean data or check data quality. To do a data quality check, click on Data Quality under Applications in the left side navigation pane. REDCap has some built-in rules that check for blank or missing data, field validation errors, outliers, and other incorrect responses. To see if there are any issues in the data, you can click Execute next to that rule, and REDCap will display any identified issues that can be then looked at more closely and corrected. REDCap also gives you the option of creating your own data quality rules and the option of running those data quality rules in real time as data is entered into the REDCap forms. Although REDCap is not a long-term data repository, it does play a role in preserving data. REDCap is meant to house active data collection. Once a data collection is complete, the data or entire REDCap project should be downloaded and transferred to a longer-term data storage option as outlined in your data management plan. Although data in REDCap is backed up, it's also a good idea to regularly download copies of your data and download completed data collections for processing and long-term storage on a regular basis. Keep in mind that for longitudinal data collections, data can be downloaded as waves of data collection are completed. REDCap also generates codebooks and data dictionaries that are needed for long-term preserving and upload to repositories. And decisions made in the planning phase around confidential data and how data can be used, and how that was incorporated into the REDCap project and forms will affect how data is downloaded and processed. For example, confidential information may be removed first. Finally, REDCap can also support data reuse. Although, again, how data can be shared or reused will be determined by ethics and how consent forms are structured and worded. So again, be very careful in how these are planned and put together. But REDCap can support data reuse in a few ways. First, data downloaded from REDCap and the supporting data documentation can be made available through data repositories or directly to other researchers for additional analyses. It is also possible to download or clone entire REDCap projects, either with the data or with the measures only. And these clones can then be shared with others and uploaded into another REDCap instance and used to support another data collection. This concludes the instructional video on how REDCap can support data management planning. A few important take-home points. First, planning is very, very, very important. The data management plan, proposal, ethics, all of this affects creation of the REDCap tool. So having these details clearly planned at the start is very helpful. REDCap can also generate several documents and files that are essential to DMPs. This includes data dictionaries, code books, and the data file itself. However, REDCap is not itself a document repository. REDCap plays a major role in data creation and collection, but it is meant for active data collection. Longer-term storage, once data collection is complete, will need to be planned and prepared for. And finally, ethics and consent are very, very important. This will affect the rest of the data management planning and how the data can be used in the future.